The village of St. Mary Mead had, as always, settled into the comfortable rhythm of early autumn. Golden leaves skittered along the cobbled streets, and the air carried the faint, sweet scent of apple orchards and freshly turned earth. It was the season when the village came together to celebrate the bounty of the harvest, an event eagerly anticipated by all, from the oldest residents who remembered decades of such gatherings, to the youngest children who ran about in careless delight. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her favorite corner of the sitting room, watched the preparations with mild curiosity. Her house overlooked the main street, and from her window she could see the villagers arranging long trestle tables, polishing silverware, and hanging bunting in cheerful autumnal colors. There was something about these events that Miss Marple always found fascinating. Not the food, nor the music, nor the laughter, but the way people revealed themselves in the smallest gestures, the anxious smoothing of a dress, a fleeting look of annoyance, a hand that lingered too long over another's. To Miss Marple, such things spoke more than words ever could. At precisely 6 o'clock, the church bell rang its familiar summons, and the villagers began to gather in the hall behind the parish church. It was a structure as old as memory itself, its worn wooden beams supporting a ceiling that had witnessed countless harvests, weddings, and funerals alike. The hall smelled faintly of polished oak and beeswax, mingling with the rich scent of roasted meats and spiced cider that drifted from the kitchens. The warmth inside was a sharp contrast to the brisk chill of the evening air outside, and the chatter of the villagers filled the space with a cozy, bustling energy. Miss Marple arrived just after the bell had ceased tolling, moving quietly through the crowd. She exchanged polite nods with familiar faces. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour. Young Peter Hawkins, who always looked slightly embarrassed by the enthusiasm of his own participation, and Mr. and Mrs. Ackroyd, who had a tendency to whisper about the relative success of last year's pie competition, as though it were a matter of life and death. Everywhere she looked, there were small dramas playing out in miniature, unnoticed by most, yet all recorded and catalogued in her mind. The tables were laden with the fruits of the season. Piled high were baskets of apples, pears, and plums, their surfaces gleaming under the hall's warm lamps. Loaves of crusty bread, still warm from the oven, were stacked neatly beside bowls of butter, cheese, and preserves. At one end of the room, the village committee had placed a grand harvest cake, decorated with intricate sugar leaves, and the carved initials SMM, St. Mary Mead, of course. The aroma was intoxicating, and many of the villagers found themselves sneaking small tastes before being noticed. Conversation swirled around Miss Marple as she moved toward her usual seat by the window. Everyone seemed pleased to see one another, yet beneath the smiles and cordial greetings, there were subtle undercurrents of tension. Mr. Giles, the local solicitor, had arrived with a rather tight expression. It was well known that he had been at odds with Mr. Thompson over the recent sale of the old mill. Mrs. Clements, whose husband had been away for months on business, whispered furiously to her neighbor about some imagined slight. Even the younger members of the village, usually unburdened by such petty conflicts, seemed slightly on edge, their laughter occasionally punctuated by glances toward corners where older villagers gathered, exchanging thinly veiled criticisms. Miss Marple, observing all of this with quiet satisfaction, felt the familiar spark of curiosity. It was not often that the entire village assembled in one place, under circumstances that could reveal human nature so openly. Her eyes flicked from one face to another, noting the small tells, the way Mrs. Price's hands trembled slightly when she handed over a slice of cake to the mayor, the nervous tightening of Peter Hawkins' jaw as he attempted to assist with the cider, and the brief, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between Mrs. Ackroyd and the Reverend. All of these details seemed inconsequential to anyone else, but to Miss Marple, they were the threads of a larger tapestry, waiting patiently to be unraveled. The mayor, a portly man with a florid complexion and a booming voice, stood at the head of the table and called the villagers to attention. Glasses were raised, and a toast was made to another successful harvest. Applause followed, and the meal began in earnest. Conversation flowed easily at first, punctuated by laughter and gentle teasing. Yet as the courses progressed, Miss Marple detected subtle shifts in tone. Voices faltered, hands paused mid-motion, and eyes darted toward corners of the room with barely concealed apprehension. It was during the serving of the main course, roast beef, accompanied by a medley of root vegetables, that the first sign of trouble made itself known. A sudden clatter rang out near the back of the hall, followed by a sharp gasp. Miss Marple's head turned almost reflexively, and her eyes fell upon a scene that caused a momentary ripple of unease among the villagers. Mr. Thompson, the mill owner, lay sprawled across the floor, his chair toppled beneath him. At first there was speculation that he had merely tripped, but the pallor of his face and the unnatural angle of his body suggested something far more sinister. Mrs. Price, ever the dramatic, rushed forward, clutching her apron to her chest. "Oh, someone call the doctor!" she cried. The room fell into a brief, disordered silence as villagers murmured anxiously to one another. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her mind quietly assessing the scene. She noted the scattered papers near the floor, the faint smear of a dark liquid on the edge of the carpet, and the uneasy shifting of Mr. Giles' feet. Her instincts whispered that what appeared to be a mere accident might in fact be something far more deliberate. By the time the village doctor arrived, the hall was abuzz with conjecture. Whispers of misfortune, old grievances, and imagined slights ricocheted from one table to another. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting yet attentive as ever, observed the villagers with the patience of one accustomed to seeing beneath surface appearances. She understood instinctively that this evening, which had begun with the promise of celebration, had turned into a delicate puzzle, one she would unravel in her own quiet and unassuming way, long before the official investigations reached any conclusion. As the doctor examined Mr. Thompson and shook his head gravely, a sense of unease settled over St. Mary Mead. The cheerful clatter of cutlery and soft laughter faded into a tense hush. And in that moment, Miss Marple, with her serene gaze and deceptively mild expression, began to consider the first threads of a mystery that would demand every ounce of her subtle insight and understanding of human nature. The Harvest Banquet, so meticulously prepared, had ended not in joy, but in suspicion, and Miss Marple knew that in a village such as this, secrets once stirred rarely remained hidden for long. By the time the initial shock had passed, St. Mary Mead had settled into a peculiar rhythm of whispered conjecture and tentative glances. The villagers lingered in the parish hall, reluctant to leave but equally reluctant to speak openly. Some had returned to their seats as though nothing had happened, fingers tapping nervously against teacups. Others congregated in small knots near the doorway, murmuring theories with voices so low that only the closest listeners could discern the words. Miss Marple, knitting calmly, observed them all, noting the subtle shifts of posture and the furtive movements that betrayed more than speech ever could. Mrs. Price was the first to break into audible speculation. "It's just dreadful. Who would even think of harming Mr. Thompson?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling slightly. She glanced at Mr. Giles, who stood nearby, his usual composure strained. "It's bound to be an accident, surely," he replied, although his tight-lipped expression suggested he was less certain than he wished to appear. Across the room, Mrs. Clements had gathered a small audience, waving her hands dramatically. "It must have been someone who resents him. That wretched mill has caused nothing but trouble for months. I heard Mr. Thompson was planning to evict poor Mrs. Langley from the cottages near the stream. Imagine, at his age, plotting such cruelty." Her neighbors nodded, some murmuring in agreement, others glancing toward the kitchens, as if hoping to see confirmation of her claims in the form of a gossiping servant. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted a different story entirely. While the villagers fussed over perceived motives, she was attuned to smaller, quieter details, the way Peter Hawkins' hands fidgeted with the napkin on his lap, or the fleeting glance Mrs. Ackroyd cast toward the pile of papers scattered near Mr. Thompson's fallen chair. Even the youngest children, who had been playing tag among the tables, now clustered near the doors, casting nervous looks at the adults as though sensing the tension that even they could not yet name. Outside, the evening had grown colder, and the fading light cast long shadows across the cobbled streets. It was as if the village itself had drawn a breath, anticipating the drama to follow. Inside the hall, the conversation had become a delicate game of accusation and defense. Mrs. Price, in her nervous agitation, suddenly turned toward Mr. Giles. "You were in the office with him this morning, weren't you? Perhaps you know more than you let on." Mr. Giles' lips pressed into a thin line. "I assure you I had nothing to do with this," he said evenly. Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple noted it with interest. Often guilt was accompanied not by the grand gestures of melodrama, but by the tiny, almost imperceptible signs that something lay beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Mrs. Clements, still embroiled in her self-appointed role of investigator, whispered to her companions. "I'll wager it was someone who's been nursing a grudge for years. Perhaps the gardener or, oh, I don't know, the vicar himself. Who can say what goes on behind closed doors?" Her companions nodded eagerly, thrilled by the prospect of scandal, while Miss Marple observed the almost theatrical way in which resentment was being woven into narrative. The children, sensing the heightened tension, began to murmur among themselves. Little Mary Jenkins tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mummy, why is everyone whispering? Was it an accident?" Her mother, Mrs. Jenkins, patted her head and whispered, "Shh, dear. We mustn't speak ill of anyone until we know the facts." Yet even in this gentle reprimand, Miss Marple noted the quiet undercurrent of fear and speculation that had already begun to take root in the youngest minds. And then there was Mr. Thompson's widow, Mrs. Thompson, who had arrived in a state of profound shock. She hovered near her husband's fallen chair, hands clasped tightly over her chest, tears threatening to spill. Her expression was one of genuine bewilderment and grief, but Miss Marple's keen observation revealed a subtle hardness in her eyes, a flicker of determination, perhaps, or merely the instinctive clarity that often accompanies those left to navigate sudden tragedy. By the time the village doctor had given his opinion, a cautionary statement that Mr. Thompson's condition required immediate care but left many details unclear, the villagers had begun to divide themselves into factions of suspicion. The more cautious muttered that it was merely an unfortunate accident. Others, however, whispered conspiratorially, certain that some hidden animosity had culminated in deliberate harm. Miss Marple, as ever, maintained her quiet presence, neither pressing her views nor joining the whispered speculation. She did, however, continue to catalogue the expressions, gestures, and hesitations of every individual. The tilt of a head, the quick glance exchanged between friends, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, all were clues, small but essential, in the careful reconstruction of the evening's events. By the time the last of the villagers had departed for their homes, casting worried glances over their shoulders, the hall had fallen into an uneasy silence. Miss Marple remained for a few moments, setting her knitting aside and examining the fallen papers near Mr. Thompson's chair. She noticed, tucked beneath the edge of one document, a small scrap of paper that seemed inconsequential yet had clearly escaped everyone else's attention. It was faintly creased as though hastily folded, and bore a few words in a hurried scrawl. "Meet me at midnight. No one must know." For most it would have been nothing more than an oddity, a trivial detail easily dismissed. But Miss Marple's mind stirred. She understood, as she always did, that in a village such as St. Mary Mead, even the smallest fragment of information might conceal the heart of a much larger story. And as she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave the hall, she allowed herself a quiet, satisfied thought. The threads of this mystery were already beginning to unravel, and though the village would gossip and speculate endlessly, she alone would see the patterns hidden beneath the surface, and in that, Miss Marple knew, lay the key to everything. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a quiet unease that seemed to cling to the village like mist. The streets were empty for longer than usual, and the usual bustle of market day was subdued, punctuated by cautious whispers and the occasional nervous glance over a shoulder. At the heart of this subdued atmosphere, Miss Marple moved with her customary calm, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables to the doctor's house, where she had been invited to offer her assistance or, as she preferred, her observations. The doctor, a kindly man named Dr. Harper, had spent much of the night attending to Mr. Thompson. The mill owner's injuries were, thankfully, not fatal, but they were severe enough to demand close monitoring. Dr. Harper, a practical man with little patience for conjecture, had already begun questioning those who had been present at the Harvest Banquet, though his inquiries were methodical rather than speculative. Miss Marple, on the other hand, knew that the truth often lay not in careful questioning, but in watching what people revealed unintentionally. The subtle inconsistencies, the fleeting expressions, the nervous gestures that escaped the conscious mind. At the doctor's house, Miss Marple first encountered Mrs. Clements, who had taken it upon herself to ensure that the doctor did not overlook any vital detail. She was perched on the edge of a chair, hands pressed tightly together, speaking in urgent, clipped sentences. "Surely someone saw something," she insisted. "It's impossible that this just happened." "You must ask again. Ask everyone." Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly, and then said in her gentle, unassuming voice, "Yes, of course. But sometimes, my dear, people reveal more in what they do not say than in what they do. One must simply know where to look." Mrs. Clements blinked, momentarily confounded by the simplicity of the remark, and Miss Marple allowed herself a small, inward smile. Often, those who rushed to judgment were the least capable of discerning subtle truth. As the morning progressed, villagers began to trickle to Dr. Harper's house under the guise of concern, though in truth, most were eager to offer speculation. Peter Hawkins, who had assisted in setting the banquet tables, looked particularly troubled. His hands fidgeted as he recounted the evening, each word carefully measured. I didn't see anything unusual," he stammered. "I mean, Mr. Thompson seemed fine. And then, well—" His voice faltered, and he glanced at Miss Marple as if hoping she might supply the missing conclusion. Miss Marple observed him quietly. His discomfort was genuine, yet there was a tension in his shoulders, a subtle tightening of the jaw that suggested he knew more than he admitted. She made a mental note to return to him later. Not with interrogation, but with gentle conversation, often the most effective way to draw out a reluctant truth. Meanwhile, Mrs. Price hovered anxiously nearby, wringing her flour-dusted hands. "It must have been deliberate," she said, her voice pitched high with fear and indignation. "Who would wish harm on Mr. Thompson? He's always been, well, yes, strict but hardly cruel." Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift toward Mrs. Price, noting the flicker of something unspoken in her expression. Anxiety, yes, but perhaps also relief that the focus of suspicion had not yet reached her own circle of acquaintances. It was in that context of subdued panic that Mr. Giles arrived, carrying his usual air of measured authority. He moved toward the doctor with careful steps, offering procedural questions and legal advice. Yet even in his composed demeanor, Miss Marple detected a small, almost imperceptible unease. His eyes occasionally darted toward the hall where the banquet had taken place the evening before, and the faint crease of worry in his brow betrayed more than his words ever would. Miss Marple, quietly observing the interplay of gestures and glances, began to form a mental map of the evening's events, not in terms of forensic detail, but in terms of human behavior. Who had looked where? Who had moved too quickly or too slowly? Whose attention had been elsewhere at the critical moment? In this, she found herself increasingly confident that the cause of Mr. Thompson's fall was not accident, but intent. Though she did not yet know by whose hand, the subtle threads of the village's social fabric became clearer as the morning unfolded. Mrs. Ackroyd, ever meticulous, arrived clutching a notebook in which she had recorded the seating arrangements and the order in which guests had been served. Her attention to detail was precise, yet Miss Marple noted a faint defensiveness in her manner, as though she feared scrutiny might reveal some minor impropriety. Nearby, Mrs. Clements whispered hurriedly to anyone who would listen, spinning elaborate theories that intertwined long-held resentments with imagined slights, each story more convoluted than the last. By midday, the hall had emptied, and the doctor had retired to his study to write his report. The villagers, restless and curious, had dispersed into smaller groups, exchanging gossip and conjecture, with the energy of a hive disturbed. Miss Marple, however, remained composed, understanding that patience and observation would yield more insight than any hurried questioning or sensational speculation. It was in these quiet hours, while the village debated and theorized, that Miss Marple first noticed the small but curious detail that would linger in her mind. A faint smudge on the back of a chair in the hall, nearly invisible, yet out of place. It was a mark that might be dismissed by anyone else. Yet to Miss Marple it suggested a movement, a gesture, a moment in which intent and opportunity converged. As she returned home, her knitting tucked under her arm, she reflected on the morning's events. The village was alive with suspicion, yet none of the villagers grasped the significance of the subtle signals, the delicate interplay of human behavior that pointed toward the truth. Miss Marple knew that the solution would not come from hurried accusations or overt confessions, but from careful attention to the nuances that everyone else overlooked. And as the afternoon sun cast a warm golden light over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple allowed herself a small secret smile. The puzzle was already beginning to take shape in her mind, and she would watch and wait, quietly guiding events toward the revelation that only she, with her gentle yet unerring insight into human nature, could uncover. By the following evening, St. Mary Mead was a village transformed. The Harvest Festival, once a symbol of abundance and conviviality, now hung in the collective memory as the scene of an unsettling incident. Conversations were hushed, and the clinking of teacups in the local tea room carried a note of tension. Most villagers spoke in speculation, but Miss Marple, ever composed, observed quietly, noting the subtle shifts in tone, posture, and expression that others overlooked. It did not take long for the first suspects to emerge. In the eyes of many, Mr. Giles, the solicitor, was the most obvious candidate. He had been close to Mr. Thompson that evening, had been involved in the mill dispute and, according to some, had made no secret of his impatience with the mill owner's stubbornness. Gossip in St. Mary Mead was a swift and unforgiving force, and it spread the theory with the efficiency of wildfire. "I saw him speaking rather sharply with Thompson," Mrs. Price confided to anyone who would listen, her flour-dusted hands gesturing emphatically. "It wouldn't surprise me at all if it was deliberate." Mr. Giles, when approached by the village constable, maintained a calm demeanor. "I assure you I would never harm Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice steady, though Miss Marple noticed the brief hesitation before he met the constable's gaze. He was careful to emphasize his attendance at the banquet, his civility toward all present, and the timing of his departure, yet the villagers, quick to fill gaps with conjecture, saw in these careful explanations a veneer of guilt rather than truth. Mrs. Clements, of course, had compiled her own list of suspects, which she circulated with fervent insistence. "The gardener," she whispered conspiratorially to a small cluster of listeners in the tea room, "or perhaps the vicar. One must consider everyone. Mr. Thompson had enemies, you know, so many enemies." Her voice rose slightly, the cadence of her sentences more theatrical than persuasive, yet she succeeded in drawing attention to otherwise overlooked individuals. Miss Marple, sipping her tea quietly, allowed herself a faint smile at the spectacle. Mrs. Clement's enthusiasm often revealed as much about her own fears as it did about the event itself. Among those whispered about were the younger villagers as well. Peter Hawkins, shy and hesitant, had inadvertently drawn suspicion merely by his nervousness during the banquet. He had helped set tables, served cider, and assisted Mrs. Price, yet his trembling hands and flushed face were interpreted by some as signs of concealment. Miss Marple noted the careful way he avoided certain glances, the subtle shifting of his weight, whenever Mr. Giles or the constable entered the room. She did not yet know whether these signs indicated guilt, embarrassment, or simply the social awkwardness of youth. Even Mrs. Ackroyd, who was usually so composed and observant herself, had come under scrutiny. Her meticulous attention to seating arrangements and her insistence on correcting minor details during the banquet were now seen by some as a form of premeditated control. "She knows more than she lets on," one villager whispered to another, leaning closer as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop. Miss Marple, however, was unconcerned. Mrs. Ackroyd's precision was typical of her personality. She was far more likely to be meticulous than malicious. As the morning progressed, the police had begun their preliminary inquiries, focusing on the obvious suspects first. They questioned Mr. Giles again, checking his whereabouts and seeking corroboration from others. They spoke with Peter Hawkins, whose responses, though honest, seemed inadequate to the investigators simply because he could not articulate the nuances of his nervousness. They noted Mrs. Ackroyd's exacting nature and Mrs. Clements's dramatics, both of which seemed suspicious under the lens of eager speculation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, conducted her own quiet observations. She spent time with each of the villagers, not asking direct questions, but encouraging conversation in gentle ways. She noted Mr. Giles's restrained concern for Mr. Thompson's well-being, Peter Hawkins' genuine confusion and anxiety, and Mrs. Ackroyd's constant, almost ritualistic, checking of every detail in the village hall. Each gesture, each hesitancy, each casual remark built a mosaic in Miss Marple's mind, one that no police report could capture. It was during a brief visit to the hall, now reopened for routine village activities, that she noticed a small, almost invisible anomaly. The chair where Mr. Thompson had fallen had a faint scratch along its rear leg, nearly imperceptible unless one was observing with deliberate attention. The tablecloth near it bore a slight crease that seemed out of place. Miss Marple noted these minor details silently. To others they were meaningless, but to her they suggested movement, struggle, and the possibility of intention where accident was assumed. By late afternoon, the villagers had divided themselves neatly into factions. Some clung to the belief that it was an accident and that no further inquiry was necessary. Others, led by Mrs. Clement's fervent whispers, were convinced that one of the obvious suspects had acted deliberately. And in the midst of this, Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting as she observed, unhurried, unjudged, and acutely aware that the first suspects were often the wrong ones, the red herrings that diverted attention from the truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, a sense of expectation settled over St. Mary Mead. The first suspects had been named, the gossip had been spread, and the stage was set for further revelation. Miss Marple, however, knew that the solution lay not in the obvious but in the overlooked, the subtle gestures, the quiet interactions, and the unspoken truths that only patient observation could reveal. And she resolved to watch, with the calm diligence of one accustomed to reading human nature as clearly as a book, until the true culprit, cloaked in deceit, was inevitably unmasked. The day after the Harvest Banquet dawned grey and misty, a soft drizzle hanging over St. Mary Mead, as if the weather itself wished to mirror the villagers' unease. Miss Marple, true to her habit of walking through the village early, observed the subtle stirrings of the day. Shopkeepers opened their doors with a cautious air, and the local school children lingered at the gates, whispering furtively about what had happened. Even the churchyard, usually serene and comforting, seemed shrouded in tension, the gravestones rising like silent witnesses to the undercurrents in the village. Miss Marple's first stop was the parish hall, now cleared of banquet tables and decorations, though faint traces of the previous night's event lingered in the air, the subtle aroma of cider and roasted meats, the faint crease of the tablecloths, and the scattered fragments of sugar leaves from the harvest cake. She walked slowly along the edges of the room, her eyes scanning every detail. To anyone else the hall appeared ordinary, untouched, yet to her trained observation it revealed secrets. She noticed a slight smear of something dark on the polished wood floor near Mr. Thompson's chair, a smudge so faint that it might have been overlooked entirely, yet it held her attention. Miss Marple crouched briefly, running a gloved finger near the edge of the mark, careful not to disturb it. It was irregular, almost imperceptible, but she understood that in a village where everyone knew each other's habits, even the smallest anomaly could carry significance. A movement had occurred here, something sudden, perhaps hurried, and certainly out of the ordinary. The smear did not appear accidental. Its placement suggested contact, something transferred by haste or perhaps struggle. Her attention then shifted to the corner of the hall where Mr. Thompson's papers had been scattered during the fall. Most villagers assumed they were irrelevant, merely the usual accounts, invoices, and letters that accompanied any man of business. Miss Marple, however, noticed a scrap of paper partially tucked beneath a ledger. Unlike the previous night, she now had the opportunity to examine it closely. The paper bore a few hurriedly scrawled words, almost illegible, but enough to suggest a secret meeting. "Do not trust anyone, midnight by the old mill." The words themselves were simple, yet Miss Marple sensed a weight in them. The use of "do not trust anyone" implied an ongoing concern, a fear or a suspicion that had been brewing before the banquet. Someone had been planning, or at least anticipating, a clandestine encounter. Her mind, as ever, turned to the people who had the most to gain or lose from Mr. Thompson's misfortune. Later, she visited the Thompson household under the guise of delivering a small basket of apples and pears from her garden. Mrs. Thompson received her with polite surprise, a flutter of relief, and yet a shadow behind her eyes betrayed the constant worry that had settled over her since her husband's accident. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said softly, "I hardly know what to do. I keep thinking it was all an accident, but everyone seems so uncertain. I can hardly bear the gossip." Miss Marple, setting the basket down gently, replied with a quiet smile. "Gossip often tells us more about the gossiper than the subject. But sometimes, my dear, it can also indicate where to look more closely." Mrs. Thompson regarded her with a faint nod, clearly puzzled by the gentle wisdom in her words. It was on the way back to her own house that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Peter Hawkins, who was sweeping the steps of the post office. He paused, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, and she observed him carefully. His movements were habitual, precise, almost as if he were performing a routine meant to calm nerves. Yet there was a slight smudge on the cuff of his sleeve, a mark dark and irregular, not unlike the one she had noticed in the hall. Peter did not see her watching and resumed his work, oblivious to the significance of the small evidence he carried on his person. Miss Marple made a note, mentally cataloguing the detail for future reference. Human behavior, more than physical evidence, was often the key to understanding motive and opportunity. A nervous gesture, a fleeting glance, a mark on a sleeve, all could reveal far more than a fingerprint or footprint. By midday she returned to the hall, this time deliberately entering with a measured air, as though she were there merely to inspect the tidiness after the event. She observed the floor, the furniture, and the faint outlines of where chairs had been shifted. And it was then, while examining the vicinity of Mr. Thompson's chair, that her eye fell upon something almost laughably small, a single fine hair caught in the crack between the polished boards. It was dark, slightly curled, and placed precisely where no one would notice unless one were looking closely. Miss Marple bent slightly, lifting it carefully with her knitting needle, inspecting it with quiet fascination. Such a minor detail would be meaningless to anyone else, yet she recognized it for what it was, a remnant of contact. Someone had been in unusually close proximity to the chair at a critical moment, and this hair was the silent witness to that contact. Her thoughts drifted to the other villagers she had observed over the past 24 hours. Who had had the opportunity to be so close to Mr. Thompson without attracting attention, and who among them might have motives strong enough to compel action, whether accidental or deliberate? She recalled Mr. Giles's composed demeanor, Peter Hawkins' nervous gestures, Mrs. Ackroyd's meticulous attention to detail, and Mrs. Clemence's dramatic assertions. All of them presented pieces of a puzzle, but only when viewed through the lens of subtle observation would the true picture emerge. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple returned home, carrying her knitting and a growing sense of purpose. She placed the scrap of paper carefully in her bag, alongside a mental note of the hair and the smear on the floor. These small, hidden clues would prove essential, she knew, not because they were dramatic or obvious, but because they revealed the intricate dance of human intention and error. That evening, the village continued its quiet murmur of speculation. The first suspects had been identified. Whispers of potential motives circulated, and yet no one had noticed the subtleties Miss Marple had already catalogued. She sat by her window, knitting slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the streets as the last lights flickered on in cottage windows. The mist had thickened now, curling around the lampposts and obscuring familiar shapes, yet Miss Marple's mind was clear, piecing together the puzzle with patience and precision. It was a minor, seemingly inconsequential detail, a scrap of paper, a smear on the floor, a single hair that promised to unlock the entire mystery. And Miss Marple, as ever, was determined to follow it wherever it might lead. In the quiet of her sitting room, she allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The threads of this mystery were delicate and hidden, yet already she sensed the shape of the truth, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And so, while the village continued to speculate and fret over what had occurred at the Harvest Banquet, Miss Marple remained calm, knowing that the smallest details often concealed the most significant truths, and that patience, observation, and an understanding of human nature would uncover what the eyes of others could not yet see. The following morning brought a chill wind through St. Mary Mead, rustling the autumn leaves like whispered secrets. Miss Marple, walking along the main street, noted the nervous energy that had settled over the village. People moved with quickened steps, avoiding eye contact or lingering in groups. Even the once cheerful chatter of the market seemed subdued, replaced by hushed murmurs and speculative glances. It was in such an atmosphere, she knew, that secrets often revealed themselves, if only one was patient enough to observe. Her first stop was the Thompson residence. Mrs. Thompson greeted her with faint relief, though the shadow in her eyes had deepened since the previous day. "I hardly slept," she admitted, wringing her hands. "The doctor says he is stable, but it is also frightening. I can't help but think someone wanted to harm him deliberately." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It is natural to feel unsettled, my dear. Sometimes in small villages, even minor tensions can surface with dramatic effect. Yet often the truth is hidden in the quietest gestures rather than the loudest accusations." Mrs. Thompson's gaze lingered on her, a mixture of confusion and hope. Miss Marple, as always, allowed her words to linger in the silence, giving the widow a measure of comfort without revealing her own conclusions. In the subtleties of human expression, she often found as much as in spoken confessions. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the parish hall under the pretext of collecting notes she had left behind. It was here that she encountered Peter Hawkins, who was sweeping the floor where Mr. Thompson had fallen. He paused when he saw her, suddenly aware of her presence. I just want everything to be as it was," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple tilted her head, observing the tension in his shoulders, the rapid blink of his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly. These were not the signs of guilt alone. They were the marks of fear and the burden of knowledge. "It is admirable to want order restored, Peter," she said softly. "Yet sometimes in attempting to preserve appearances, one overlooks the significance of small details. Did you notice anything unusual that night?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to overhear. "Well, I thought I saw Mr. Thompson arguing quietly with Mr. Giles before the meal. But it seemed minor, and I didn't think it mattered at the time." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Even minor disputes, she knew, could mask deeper resentments, especially when pride, property, or reputation were at stake. She made a mental note of Peter's observation, tucking it away alongside the small clues she had already collected. Her attention then turned to Mrs. Ackroyd, who had been unusually restless over the past day. Visiting her home under the pretense of borrowing a book on local history, Miss Marple observed the subtle signs of anxiety in her guest. The careful straightening of cushions, the repetitive dusting of a small corner table, the quick glance at the clock whenever a servant passed by, all hinted at a preoccupation beyond mere domestic habit. "I suppose you are concerned about Mr. Thompson," Miss Marple ventured gently, stirring a cup of tea. Mrs. Ackroyd stiffened, then exhaled slowly. "It is unsettling, yes," she admitted. "He could be difficult, though always fair. Yet in recent weeks there have been tensions in the village, old grievances, I suppose, resurfacing. Some people take offense at the smallest slight, and pride can make them reckless." Miss Marple nodded, listening with the patience of someone accustomed to reading between lines. Indeed, the tapestry of human relationships in a village such as St. Mary Mead was intricate and fragile. And any disruption, especially one as dramatic as an apparent attempt on Mr. Thompson's life, would strain it further. The day's revelations, though subtle, were amplified later when Mrs. Clements arrived at Miss Marple's home, her voice urgent, her gestures frantic. "It is impossible. Someone must be responsible. I heard from Mrs. Price that Mr. Giles had been unusually insistent about leaving the hall right before the fall. Surely that cannot be coincidence." Miss Marple offered a mild smile. "Yes, coincidences often appear suspicious when viewed through a lens of fear. Yet it is important to distinguish between what is likely and what merely seems likely." Mrs. Clements's eyes widened, but she said nothing further, realizing that Miss Marple's gentle demeanor concealed a sharp acuity. Indeed, the true significance of events often lay in the quiet, unobserved moments, not in the loud declarations of anxiety or accusation. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Miss Marple returned once more to the parish hall, retracing the events of the banquet with careful attention. It was here that she noticed something previously overlooked, a faint footprint in the dust near the rear of the hall. Not immediately obvious, it suggested someone had been present at the edge of the tables, perhaps watching or moving with a purpose unnoticed by others. The size, shape, and depth hinted at a smaller figure, light, cautious, deliberate. Her mind pieced together the growing pattern, Peter Hawkins' nervous movements, the furtive glance of Mrs. Ackroyd, the apparent tension between Mr. Thompson and Mr. Giles, and now the footprint in the dust. Each detail, minor on its own, formed a lattice of opportunity, intent, and human complexity. Miss Marple knew that motives in small villages were rarely simple. Pride, fear, jealousy, and long-buried resentment often intertwined to produce actions that might seem inexplicable to outsiders. Later, she called upon the village constable, who was still grappling with the first wave of suspicion. "Constable," she said softly, "it is important to note not only what people do, but what they avoid doing. Sometimes the hesitation to act reveals more than a dramatic gesture ever could." The constable nodded, though he did not yet grasp the subtleties she implied. That would come in time. By evening, St. Mary Mead was a village in quiet turmoil. Families spoke in hushed tones, exchanging reports of overheard words and curious observations. Villagers speculated endlessly about motives, yet none had noticed the small, telling details Miss Marple had observed: a scrap of paper signaling a secret meeting, a faint smear of unknown origin, a single curl of hair, a small footprint in dust. All of these were silent witnesses to human intention, invisible to all but those willing to look beyond the obvious. As darkness fell, Miss Marple settled in her sitting room, the warm glow of the lamp casting soft shadows across her knitting. She reflected on the day's discoveries, each conversation, each nervous glance, each carefully avoided eye contact. The web of interactions revealed more than any confession or accusation, and she understood, with her usual quiet certainty, that the heart of the mystery lay not in what had been said aloud, but in what had been deliberately hidden or unconsciously revealed in the behavior of those around her. Patience, observation, and a deep understanding of human nature were her tools. And Miss Marple, with her serene demeanor and subtle wit, knew that the village's tangled secrets were slowly but surely revealing themselves. Soon, she thought, the threads of this puzzle would begin to converge, and the hidden motives and carefully concealed intentions would come to light. Until then, she would watch and wait, quietly gathering the knowledge that would allow her to unmask the truth, without ever alarming those whose secrets were most at stake. The following day, a sharp frost had settled over St. Mary Mead, crisping the leaves along the village lanes and frosting the edges of the windows. The harvest season, once a time of abundance and cheer, had become overshadowed by unease. The villagers moved with measured steps, their whispers carrying like faint echoes across the cobblestones. Rumors that had begun as speculation now had the weight of suspicion behind them, and yet, to Miss Marple's practiced eye, the threads of truth remained concealed beneath layers of fear, pride, and habit. It was during mid-morning that news arrived to stir both consternation and fresh intrigue. The mill, owned by Mr. Thompson, had been found in partial disarray, the door ajar and the interior appearing as if someone had searched in haste. A small ledger, important for the mill's accounts, was missing, though the papers surrounding it remained untouched. Constable Penny had been called, and villagers gathered in murmured clusters, each offering their own interpretation. The theft, or apparent theft, added a new layer of complexity to the events surrounding the banquet, suggesting that the incident had not been as simple as an unfortunate accident. Miss Marple, listening quietly from the edge of the crowd, noted the reactions. Mrs. Clemence's hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide with imagined drama. "It is perfectly clear now," she exclaimed. "Whoever tried to harm Mr. Thompson was after something specific. This is no accident. It is deliberate, and the person responsible is clever, for they left almost everything intact to confuse us." Her companions nodded with unquestioning agreement, while Miss Marple observed with mild amusement. The true elegance of the criminal mind, she knew, lay often in subtlety rather than spectacle. Peter Hawkins, meanwhile, appeared unusually pale as he spoke with a neighbor. His gestures were cautious, hesitant, as though fearing that even casual words might be misconstrued. Miss Marple noted the slight dark smudge on his sleeve, now visible even in daylight, and the way his fingers fidgeted with a piece of string from his apron. These minor details, overlooked by others, suggested proximity, not merely to the accident but to the events that had followed. Yet whether by intention or circumstance, Miss Marple could not yet determine. Mrs. Ackroyd, on the other hand, moved among the crowd with her usual meticulous attention, inspecting the doorway, scanning the floor, and noting the arrangement of ledgers and tools. Her eyes lingered on a small overturned box near the edge of the mill, a detail unnoticed by others. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the almost imperceptible anxiety in her friend's face, an anxiety that could stem from genuine concern or from knowledge she wished to conceal. In a village where everyone knew one another, both possibilities were worth noting. Constable Penny was already making preliminary inquiries, though his focus remained on the obvious: who had entered the mill and why. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, allowed him to conduct his investigation, while she quietly catalogued her own observations. She noted the footprints near the door, delicate as if left by someone of light step, and the faint smudge on the threshold, which suggested hurried contact. Even the absence of certain papers could be as revealing as the presence of others. Missing items often pointed to motive in a way no one considered when eyes were fixed solely on accusation. By midday, Miss Marple had returned home to examine the small scrap of paper she had found previously at the parish hall, the one that hinted at a secret midnight meeting. She now considered it in the context of the new disturbance at the mill. If someone had sought to harm Mr. Thompson or conceal evidence, the meeting might have been a rendezvous for more than a simple exchange of messages. The alignment of events, the fall at the banquet, the discovery at the mill, and the careful disappearance of a ledger suggested a plan executed with precision and awareness of human behavior. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Thompson, who carried a look of quiet distress. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "the doctor says my husband is improving, but he asks constantly about the mill. He is worried, of course, though he does not yet realize the full extent of what has occurred." Miss Marple nodded gently. "The worry is understandable," she replied. "But sometimes, my dear, the truth is less in what is obvious and more in what is overlooked." Mrs. Thompson's eyes lingered on her, uncomprehending yet trusting, and Miss Marple allowed the silence to speak for itself. The afternoon brought further intrigue. A package, small and neatly wrapped, was delivered anonymously to the village post office. Constable Penny opened it with care, revealing a series of letters written in a hurried hand. They contained veiled warnings, mentions of debts and grievances, and cryptic phrases that suggested prior knowledge of events at both the banquet and the mill. The villagers crowded around, eager to glean insight, yet none but Miss Marple discerned the subtle implications. The handwriting, she observed, was familiar, careful but irregular, suggesting someone unaccustomed to composing such messages but intent on secrecy. Miss Marple's mind began to weave the pieces together. The ledger taken from the mill, the scrap of paper directing a secret meeting, Peter Hawkins' nervous behavior, Mrs. Ackroyd's careful attention, and the anonymous letters all formed a network of connections. None of these elements alone provided certainty, but collectively they suggested a sequence of events, orchestrated with knowledge of human nature and the predictable tendencies of a small community. She also considered the psychological subtleties revealed in the villagers' reactions, Mrs. Clement's dramatic assertions, Mrs. Price's anxious gossip, and the hesitant evasions of Peter Hawkins all provided insight into their fears, loyalties, and potential motives. Miss Marple understood that deception was rarely obvious. It was embedded in hesitation, misdirection, and the careful manipulation of appearances. The real culprit, she suspected, would exploit the villagers' predictable behaviors to conceal intent and opportunity alike. As evening approached, Miss Marple strolled once more through the village, her steps deliberate and unhurried. The mist had thickened again, curling around the lampposts and obscuring familiar landmarks. Yet her mind was alert, cataloguing the behaviors she had observed, connecting them to the events that had unfolded. She knew that another twist would be necessary to fully reveal the depth of the plot, and that subtle manipulations would become apparent only with patience. Back in her sitting room, she laid out her notes, reviewing the small clues, the scrap of paper, the hair, the smudge on the floor. Peter's anxious behavior, the footprint, Mrs. Ackroyd's attention to the box, the missing ledger, and the cryptic letters. Each seemed minor on its own, yet in combination they created a pattern that suggested intention and premeditation. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The true nature of the crime was beginning to emerge, hidden beneath layers of misdirection and the natural fears of the villagers. She understood, as she often did, that patience and observation would uncover not only the means, but the motive, and that the careful orchestration of events by the perpetrator would eventually reveal itself when the time was right. And so the village of St. Mary Mead, already restless with suspicion, faced a new layer of intrigue. What had seemed a single accident now appeared as part of a deliberate scheme, the threads of which were carefully woven to exploit the predictable tendencies of the people around it. Miss Marple, calm and deliberate, knew that the true resolution of the mystery was approaching, and that another twist, unexpected, subtle, and revealing, would soon force the hand of the culprit, leaving the village to confront truths they had long avoided. The day after the new revelations at the mill, Miss Marple moved with her customary calm through St. Mary Mead. The chill of late autumn had sharpened the air, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and distant smoke. Villagers, still unsettled, kept their conversations subdued, conscious that the net of suspicion had widened, yet no one had been conclusively accused. Miss Marple, however, observed each gesture, each glance, each hesitation, with the serenity of one who understands that human nature is the greatest revealer of truth. She decided that it was time for a subtle test, one designed not to accuse, but to watch reactions, to let the truth reveal itself through instinct, fear, or pride. She began with Mr. Giles, who had been identified by several villagers as the most obvious suspect. Visiting his home under the guise of delivering her latest batch of preserves, she engaged him in casual conversation about the banquet, the mill, and local affairs. Her questions were innocent, almost trivial, yet she emphasized certain details deliberately. Watching carefully, "You must find it frustrating," she remarked lightly, "that the villagers are so eager to assign blame after the least incident. It makes one wonder how little people notice the smaller, quieter details." Mr. Giles chuckled nervously, brushing his hand across the back of a chair. "Indeed," he replied, with just the faintest quiver in his voice. Miss Marple made no comment, only noted the hesitation and the direction of his gaze, which flickered briefly toward the window before returning to her. Her next visit was to Peter Hawkins. This she approached differently. In the guise of discussing the harvest decorations, she casually mentioned the scrap of paper directing a secret meeting and the anonymous letters found at the post office. Peter's reaction was instantaneous. His eyes widened, his lips parted slightly, and his hands fidgeted as if he had touched something he ought not to have. I don't know anything about that," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. His reaction was neither proof of guilt nor innocence, but it provided insight into his awareness and fear, essential threads in the growing web of understanding. Mrs. Ackroyd was next, visited under the pretense of borrowing a book on local history. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift casually toward the events at the banquet and the mill. Noting the meticulous way Mrs. Ackroyd straightened a vase, brushed a speck of dust from a shelf, and glanced toward the door. "You know," Miss Marple said softly, "it is curious how sometimes the smallest details, the misplaced chair, the smudge on the floor, even a single hair, can reveal more than the loudest accusations." Mrs. Ackroyd's eyes flickered briefly, and she allowed a faint sigh to escape, as if the reminder of those overlooked minutiae carried with it a weight she could scarcely bear. The subtlety of the test was in observing what each person did not say, how they reacted to the mere suggestion of what had occurred. Miss Marple understood that guilt, fear, or complicity often manifests most clearly in the nervous avoidance of discussion, in averted eyes, or in gestures that betray hidden knowledge. She did not confront directly. She allowed the circumstances to reveal themselves naturally, confident in her understanding of human behavior. Later, she orchestrated a more deliberate scenario. Arranging for a small gathering at her own home, under the pretense of tea, she invited a selection of villagers, including Mr. Giles, Mrs. Ackroyd, Peter Hawkins, and even Mrs. Clements, whose dramatic tendencies made her a particularly useful witness to the reactions of others. The room was arranged deliberately, chairs positioned to observe interactions, subtle emphasis on proximity and eye contact, small clues casually placed where they might be noticed. As the tea progressed, Miss Marple spoke casually of the mill and the scrap of paper, of the ledger and the anonymous letters. Her tone was gentle, almost conversational, yet she emphasized minor points as though they were incidental. The responses were revealing. Mr. Giles maintained composure, though his fingers drummed lightly on the saucer. Peter Hawkins shifted uneasily, glancing toward the doorway as if expecting someone to arrive. Mrs. Ackroyd straightened repeatedly, her gaze flicking toward the previously unnoticed box, now casually placed on a table. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to flow naturally, observing the interplay of guilt, fear, and pretense. She posed questions indirectly. "I wonder," she said softly, "how someone might misinterpret a small gesture or overlook a single detail. One might see a smudge on the floor and think it nothing, yet it could indicate so much about what occurred." Each listener reacted differently, some with curiosity, some with subtle alarm, others with nervous avoidance. The key, she understood, was patience. Human nature cannot be rushed. The guilty instinctively reveal themselves, not through confession but through behavior, through instinctive reactions to subtle cues. Miss Marple's role was not to accuse openly, but to provide a situation in which those reactions would become visible, allowing truth to emerge naturally. By mid-afternoon, she had observed enough to form a clearer picture. Peter Hawkins' anxiety, while pronounced, seemed rooted more in fear of accusation than in actual involvement. Mr. Giles' composure, though superficially reassuring, had revealed slight inconsistencies in tone and gesture that suggested stress but not necessarily guilt. Mrs. Ackroyd's attention to detail, previously dismissed as habit, now carried a significance that required further reflection. Miss Marple allowed the gathering to dissolve, expressing gratitude for the company and the conversation. As the villagers departed, she reflected on what she had seen. The threads of the mystery were now more apparent, the subtle interplay of human behavior, the hidden motives that drove actions, the careful concealment of intent behind social niceties. Each reaction she had witnessed would become part of her mental map of the events surrounding the Harvest Banquet and the mill. Returning to her sitting room as dusk fell, she arranged her notes carefully. The scrap of paper, the hair, the smudge, the footprint, the ledger, and the letters were now joined by her observations of human behavior. The nervous glances, the subtle hesitations, the gestures of avoidance or overcompensation, all pointed toward the orchestrated nature of the events and toward the individual whose actions had woven the web of deception. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting, her sharp eyes scanning the window as the last light faded from the village. She allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The final test had revealed much, not guilt in overt confession, but in instinct and reaction, in the subtle indications that only a patient observer could discern. She now knew the shape of the truth and understood that the moment for revelation would soon arrive, orchestrated with the same precision and patience she had employed to uncover it. In the hush of her sitting room, she mused that human nature was, as always, the greatest mystery of all. And in St. Mary Mead, as the mist thickened and the village settled uneasily for the night, the concealed motives, careful deceptions, and hidden truths of the Harvest Banquet were poised to come fully to light, revealed not through force or accusation, but through observation, patience, and the gentle genius of Miss Marple. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over St. Mary Mead, the frost glinting in the weak autumn sun like scattered diamonds. There was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that the village was collectively holding its breath, aware that something momentous was about to unfold. Miss Marple, serene and composed as ever, prepared for the delicate moment when the threads of observation, patience, and subtle deduction would converge. The hour had come to expose the truth, not with accusation alone, but with gentle precision that would allow the hidden motives and carefully concealed actions to speak for themselves. Miss Marple invited the key figures to her sitting room under the pretense of tea. Mr. Giles, Peter Hawkins, Mrs. Ackroyd, Mrs. Clements, and even Mrs. Thompson accepted, unaware of the true purpose behind the invitation. The atmosphere was polite, restrained, with a faint murmur of conversation attempting to disguise the nervous anticipation of the villagers. Miss Marple, moving among them with her usual calm grace, poured tea, arranged plates of biscuits, and set the scene with the unremarkable air of ordinary hospitality. "Thank you all for coming," she began softly, settling into her chair with knitting in hand. "I thought it would be pleasant to gather and reflect upon the events of the Harvest Banquet and the days that followed. It is remarkable," she added, glancing at each guest in turn, "how small details, often overlooked, can reveal so much when observed closely." Her voice was gentle, yet each word carried the weight of subtle meaning, prompting attention without alarm. She began to recount the events carefully, describing the fall at the banquet, the minor disturbances at the mill, and the discovery of the anonymous letters. Each detail was delivered with the calm detachment of one recounting a story rather than leveling accusations. The villagers listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uneasily, all absorbing the careful observations Miss Marple had so meticulously catalogued. "Now," she continued, "I have observed the behaviors, small gestures, and reactions of those involved. Sometimes the truth is not revealed in dramatic confrontation, but in the way people respond when they believe they are merely conversing with a friend." She looked at Peter Hawkins, who shifted slightly, the dark smudge on his sleeve catching the morning light. "Peter, do you recall the scrap of paper found at the parish hall directing a secret meeting?" Peter swallowed, his hands fidgeting as he glanced toward the floor. "Yes, Miss Marple," he murmured. "And the letters at the post office," Miss Marple continued, her tone soft yet deliberate, which warned of debts, grievances, and hinted at knowledge of events both at the banquet and the mill. Peter nodded again, his unease growing, though his silence suggested fear more than culpability. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Mrs. Ackroyd. "And you, my dear, were very attentive to a small box in the parish hall, a detail overlooked by everyone else. You noticed it, did you not?" Mrs. Ackroyd's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "Yes, I saw it," she admitted softly, "but I did not think it important." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, nodding, "it is often the smallest objects that bear the heaviest significance, and sometimes observing how others react to them tells us more than we realize." She paused, allowing the statement to sink in, her eyes lingering on the assembled group. Then she spoke of the subtle smear on the floor near Mr. Thompson's chair, the single hair discovered, and the faint footprint at the mill. Each piece was presented with calm clarity, without drama, yet together they formed a pattern that no attentive observer could ignore. The villagers murmured among themselves, beginning to see the connections Miss Marple had quietly noted over the preceding days. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting resting gently on her lap. All of these clues, minor, almost imperceptible to the unobservant, point to a single truth. They tell us who had the opportunity, who understood the consequences of small actions, and who attempted to manipulate circumstances to hide intention. Her gaze fell finally upon Mr. Giles, and it is clear to me that the person responsible sought to protect appearances while ensuring certain events unfolded exactly as planned. Mr. Giles's face paled, and he opened his mouth to speak, only to falter. Peter Hawkins glanced at him nervously. Mrs. Ackroyd's hands tightened around her teacup, and Mrs. Clements leaned forward, a faint gasp escaping her lips. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, coaxing rather than confronting. The ledger taken from the mill, the orchestrated disturbances, and the attempts to divert suspicion were all designed to conceal a personal grievance, a long-standing matter of pride, resentment, and opportunity, she continued, her eyes steady on Mr. Giles. Your interactions with Mr. Thompson, though outwardly cordial, concealed irritation and a desire to influence the outcome of the Harvest Banquet and its associated events. You believed that a minor accident could be construed as coincidence, while leaving the ledger and the letters to mislead others. Mr. Giles's composure finally broke. It was meant to be harmless. I only wanted to scare him, not... His voice faltered, eyes darting toward the floor. Miss Marple's calm gaze held him, guiding him gently toward the admission he could not yet voice fully. "The truth," she said softly, "often manifests in actions rather than words. You relied on the predictable reactions of those around you, assuming that subtle manipulations and hidden gestures would keep you beyond suspicion. Yet as always, it is the small details, the smudge, the hair, the footprint, the reaction to observation, that reveal what we think we can conceal." Peter Hawkins exhaled, relief evident despite his own anxiety, as he realized he had been mistakenly suspected. Mrs. Ackroyd nodded slowly, comprehension dawning as she understood the precision of the orchestration. Mrs. Clemence's dramatic gasp became a subdued acknowledgement of the truth, while Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened, registering both relief and shock at the revelation of motive within the familiar village circle. Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence, letting the full weight of the revelation settle. "So, my friends," she said finally, her tone warm, "we have seen how the subtleties of human behavior, the minutiae of observation, and the patient cataloguing of small details can uncover the truth where forceful accusation might fail. Justice need not be loud. It may be quiet, precise, and entirely revealing." Mr. Giles, finally understanding that his attempt at concealment had failed, bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Yes, Miss Marple," he whispered, "I understand now." The others, absorbing the revelation, experienced a mixture of relief and astonishment. The web of deceit, carefully spun in the shadows of the village's social norms and personal resentments, had been unraveled not by dramatic confrontation or forensic evidence, but by the quiet, patient observation of a mind attuned to human nature. Miss Marple, knitting calmly, allowed a faint smile. The mystery was resolved, the threads carefully untangled, and the village could, in time, return to its ordinary rhythms, though subtly altered by the knowledge of what lay beneath familiar faces. The week following the revelation of Mr. Giles's involvement in the incidents surrounding the Harvest Banquet brought a cautious calm to St. Mary Mead. The village, though relieved that the mystery had been resolved, moved with a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. People spoke softly in doorways, and gatherings were attended with polite reserve. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted these subtle changes in behavior with mild satisfaction. Human nature, she mused, rarely returned immediately to its previous ease, once it had been confronted with deception and hidden motives. At the Thompson residence, life resumed its familiar pace, though with an added vigilance. Mr. Thompson, still recovering from his fall, expressed both gratitude and astonishment at Miss Marple's gentle unraveling of events. "I never suspected," he admitted one morning over tea, "that what seemed such a trivial altercation at the banquet could conceal so much intent. And yet it all makes sense now." Mrs. Thompson, her hands clasped over her teacup, nodded in agreement, the tension in her shoulders easing as the truth had finally been brought to light. Miss Marple visited the mill later that morning, walking along the quiet paths with Peter Hawkins. The young man seemed lighter in spirit, his previous nervousness replaced by a tentative relief. "I suppose I am fortunate," he said quietly, "that the truth was discovered without unnecessary scandal. I feared that suspicion would fall heavily on me, and perhaps even others." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "Suspicion often lingers longer than guilt, my dear. Yet it is remarkable what patience and observation can achieve. People, if watched carefully, reveal more than they intend to, and truth, when approached quietly, emerges in its own time." At Mrs. Ackroyd's home, conversation was measured and subdued. She admitted to herself as she polished a shelf that had once seemed unimportant that her attention to detail had been unwittingly significant in the resolution of the mystery. Small acts, minor observations, and inadvertent gestures had all contributed to Miss Marple's unraveling of events. It was a humbling realization that even ordinary villagers could play a part in revealing the extraordinary truths hidden beneath routine life. The village itself seemed to breathe more easily. Shops reopened with customary cheer, children played along the lanes once more, and the local market resumed its bustle. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple observed a subtle unease. People glanced at one another with measured caution, aware that hidden tensions could emerge at any time, that pride, resentment, or old grievances could yet influence behavior. St. Mary Mead had returned to normal, but only in appearance. The memory of the Harvest Banquet and the carefully concealed plot lingered like an echo in every interaction. Constable Penny, reflecting on the events, admitted privately to Miss Marple that he had learned more about human nature in the past week than in all previous years of service. "I had assumed," he confessed, "that such mysteries could be solved by observation and questioning alone, but I see now the depth of insight required. Your approach, Miss Marple, was remarkable in its subtlety and effectiveness." Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the window, allowed a faint smile. "Patience, Constable, and attention to small details. People reveal themselves in their smallest gestures, their avoidance of certain subjects, and the consistency or inconsistency of their reactions. One need not confront. One need only observe." The villagers, having digested the revelation, began to restore social bonds strained by suspicion. Mrs. Clements, who had once delighted in dramatic conjecture, now spoke with careful moderation, understanding that sensationalism could distort perception. Mrs. Price, who had delighted in idle gossip, chose her words with greater deliberation, aware that even the faintest misinterpretation could carry consequences. St. Mary Mead's social fabric, though tested, was mending under the quiet guidance of shared awareness and the subtle influence of Miss Marple's wisdom. Even Mr. Giles, though facing the consequences of his actions, approached the situation with a composed acknowledgement of responsibility. The village, guided by justice tempered with understanding, allowed him to make amends where possible, mitigating scandal without excusing the intent or its effects. Miss Marple had ensured that resolution did not rely solely on punishment, but on comprehension, understanding the interplay of pride, resentment, and opportunity that had led to the disruption of the Harvest Banquet. Miss Marple herself resumed her ordinary routines with her characteristic calm. She visited friends, tended her garden, and walked the familiar paths of the village. Yet she remained ever observant, noting subtle changes in posture, expression, and behavior that might indicate lingering tension or unspoken truths. To the casual observer, she seemed merely a retired lady with a fondness for knitting and tea. To those attuned to the nuances of human nature, she remained the quiet guardian of insight, seeing beyond appearances to the realities concealed beneath. In the evenings, the village settled into a gentle rhythm. Lanterns glowed softly in windows, the distant chimneys released thin streams of smoke into the crisp night air, and the quiet of the countryside returned. Miss Marple, knitting by her lamp, reflected on the events that had unfolded. She considered the fall at the banquet, the disturbances at the mill, the missing ledger, and the anonymous letters. Each element, she knew, had been part of a complex interplay of human behavior, where opportunity and resentment converged with subtlety. Her reflections turned to the nature of small communities, where secrets are rarely hidden completely, but concealed within daily interactions and social norms. Pride, jealousy, and old grudges create invisible patterns that, if observed patiently, reveal truths inaccessible to force or argument. Miss Marple mused that it was precisely this understanding of human behavior, cultivated over years of quiet observation, that enabled her to unravel mysteries that confounded others, and so St. Mary Mead returned to its outward tranquility. The Harvest Banquet, once marred by an unsettling incident, became a memory softened by the passage of days. Yet the villagers carried with them a heightened awareness of one another, a subtle acknowledgement that beneath calm façades, intentions and motives may be carefully concealed. Miss Marple, content with the knowledge that truth had prevailed, allowed herself a quiet smile. Human nature, she thought, is at once predictable and endlessly fascinating, revealing itself to those who watch with patience, empathy, and insight. As night fell, casting long shadows across the village lanes, Miss Marple settled in her favourite chair, knitting needles in hand. Hand looked out upon St. Mary Mead, with the serene satisfaction of one who has witnessed justice done not through confrontation, but through the careful, gentle revelation of truth. The village slept, the mystery resolved, yet the quiet lessons of human behaviour would linger, shaping interactions in ways both subtle and enduring. The early morning mist clung to the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of hedgerows and cottages. The village had resumed its ordinary pace, yet there remained a subtle hush, a consciousness of events that had unfolded in the days since the Harvest Banquet. Miss Marple, knitting in her favourite armchair by the window, observed the scene with her usual calm attentiveness. To the casual eye, it was merely another autumn morning, but to her every gesture, every glance, held a quiet significance, a whisper of human nature revealed in the simplest interactions. The villagers moved with cautious normality, each one carrying the memory of revelations and the implicit understanding that beneath familiar faces, motives and secrets could hide. Mr. Thompson, restored to strength, greeted neighbours with polite cheer, yet there was in his smile a lingering awareness of human complexity. Peter Hawkins walked with lighter steps, relieved that suspicion had shifted from him, though the faint shadow of his recent anxiety remained etched in the way he straightened his posture. Mrs. Ackroyd, meticulous and observant as ever, seemed to move with an added mindfulness, aware that her keen attention could reveal truths even when unintended. Miss Marple reflected on the patterns she had observed: the fall at the banquet, the subtle disruption at the mill, the missing ledger, the anonymous letters, and the reactions of those involved. Each event had been a test of character and instinct, revealing how pride, fear, resentment, and loyalty interplay within a small community. She mused that it was never solely the overt actions that spoke the loudest, but the minute, almost imperceptible behaviors that betrayed thought, intention, and conscience. In this she found the enduring fascination of her craft, the quiet revelation of truth through patient observation. In the village square, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with care, children laughed as they ran between the stalls, and neighbours exchanged greetings steeped in cautious camaraderie. Yet the undercurrent of awareness persisted. Miss Marple noted with her characteristic subtlety the way villagers now measured their words, the slight hesitations in conversation, the careful consideration of gestures and tone. Trust had been tempered, and prudence had been elevated, but the social fabric remained intact, strengthened by the knowledge that truth once revealed must be acknowledged and understood. Her thoughts drifted to Mr. Giles, who had accepted responsibility with quiet dignity. There was a lesson, she reflected, in the manner of his contrition. It was never enough simply to conceal wrongdoing or manipulate appearances. The subtleties of behavior, the predictable tendencies of those around him, and the careful observation of a keen mind ensured that truth would emerge, sooner or later. Pride, resentment, or fear, no matter how carefully hidden, could never entirely escape the watchful eye of patience. Miss Marple's musings extended to the broader nature of human interaction. In small communities like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knows one another's habits, histories, and dispositions, deception is never absolute. Even the most cautious scheme leaves traces, subtle patterns that reveal intent to those who know how to observe. The art, she considered, was in discerning which details mattered, which reactions were genuine and which were masks meant to mislead. This delicate balance of attention, empathy, and patience had been the instrument by which the recent mystery had been unraveled. In her garden, the last chrysanthemums of the season bent under the weight of morning frost. Miss Marple paused in her routine, noting the way the petals curled at the edges, the subtle difference in colour, and the occasional leaf fallen where it should not have been. Small deviations, she reflected, often spoke more than overt disturbances. People, like gardens, reveal themselves in the patterns of their growth, the disturbances they conceal, and the gentle marks left by external forces. Observation, patience, and understanding were the gardener's tools in both horticulture and the unravelling of human mysteries. The villagers, for their part, began to acknowledge the lessons imparted by the events surrounding the Harvest Banquet. Mrs. Clements, once given to dramatic conjecture, now listened more attentively, recognizing the consequences of exaggerated assumptions. Mrs. Price, who had previously delighted in idle gossip, tempered her words with greater care, understanding that even the smallest misstatement could propagate fear or false suspicion. These subtle shifts in behavior were perhaps the most enduring legacy of the mystery, a quiet refinement of awareness and discretion that would shape interactions long after the final revelation. Miss Marple, reflecting on the entire sequence of events, recognized the elegant symmetry of human nature in all its complexity. The fall, the disruption, the letters and the subtle behaviors had combined to reveal a tapestry of motives and intentions, each one interconnected in ways that only careful observation could untangle. The resolution had not required spectacle, force, or dramatic confrontation, but the gentle, persistent illumination of truth. And in this illumination lay both the lesson and the satisfaction of understanding human nature at its most revealing. As dusk approached, the village settled into an almost serene quiet. Smoke curled from chimneys, casting thin trails into the dimming sky, and lanterns glowed softly in the windows of cottages. The sound of distant footsteps along the lane reminded Miss Marple of the constancy of village life, the routines, the interactions, and the ever-present opportunity for hidden intentions to reveal themselves. She reflected that St. Mary Mead, for all its tranquility, contained within it the same range of emotions, desires, and vulnerabilities found in any community, only magnified by the closeness of its small population. Sitting in her armchair, knitting needles moving with gentle rhythm, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of contentment. The village was safe, the mystery resolved, and human nature had been observed and understood with its full richness. She considered the delicate balance of concealment and revelation, pride and humility, fear and courage which had shaped recent events. It was in these subtleties, rather than overt action, that the truth of the Harvest Banquet had been unveiled, and it was in this understanding that the quiet genius of her method lay. And so, with the village bathed in the soft glow of evening light, and the last traces of autumn mist dissipating, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons of human behavior. People she knew revealed themselves not in the grand gestures, but in the smallest of actions, the fleeting expressions and the subtle deviations from habit. The events surrounding the Harvest Banquet had reminded St. Mary Mead of this eternal truth, and Miss Marple, serene and knowing, continued her quiet watch, content in the knowledge that observation, patience, and understanding would always uncover what the heart sought to conceal.